The return to Ashford detective Marcus Hale had returned to Ashford under the same gray sky that had haunted his memories for years. The rain had not yet begun to fall, but the air was thick with the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He had left this town nearly a decade ago, after the case that had nearly broken him. Now he was back, not for the sake of nostalgia, but because a new mystery had emerged, one that seemed to echo the past in ways that could not be ignored. Ashford was a small town, one of those places that clung to its history like a ghost to a forgotten memory. The streets were lined with old wooden houses, some still standing, others long since crumbled into the earth. The town had once been a thriving community, but over the years it had become a place of whispers and secrets. Marcus had always felt a strange pull to this place, as if the town itself had called him back. Now, as he walked through the narrow streets, he could see the same shadows that had once haunted his dreams. The first clue came as he approached the old Whitmore house, a place that had been abandoned for over 20 years. It stood at the edge of town, its windows dark and its door rusted with age. The wind howled through the empty halls, carrying with it the scent of something old, something that should have been buried long ago. Marcus had never been inside that house, but he had heard the stories. The Whitmore family had disappeared without a trace, and the house had been left to rot, untouched by time. As he stood before the house, he could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. Something about this place felt wrong, as if the very air was thick with the remnants of a tragedy that had never been fully uncovered. He had come back to Ashford to solve a new case, but now he wasn't sure if he had returned for the present or to confront the past that had been waiting for him all along. The disappearance of Emily Carter. The first clue came in the form of a missing child. Emily Carter, a 10-year-old girl who had vanished without a trace from her home just 2 weeks ago. Her disappearance had sent shockwaves through the town, and the fear that had once "Fast, he could fast is not," or to confront the past that had been waiting for him all along. The disappearance of Emily Carter. The first clue came in the form of a missing child. Or been confined to the shadows of the Whitmore house had now spread into the very heart of Ashford. Emily had been the daughter of Sarah and Thomas Carter, a couple who had lived in the town for over a decade. They had been well respected, even admired by many, but now their lives had been turned upside down by the unspeakable horror of their child's disappearance. The police had launched an immediate investigation, but the case had quickly become one of the most perplexing in recent memory. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no witnesses to provide any leads. The only clue was a single blood-stained sock found near the edge of the woods just outside the town. It had been discovered by a local hunter who had been tracking a deer when he stumbled upon the item. The sock had been left behind in a way that suggested the child had run, but there was no indication of where she had gone. The town had been thrown into a state of panic. The once quiet streets now buzzed with hushed conversations and anxious glances. People who had once lived their lives in peace now found themselves questioning their neighbors, their friends, even their own families. The sheriff, a man named James Holloway, had taken the case personally, but even he had found himself at a loss. The case had no clear direction, no obvious suspects, and no answers. As the investigation continued, the town's unease only deepened. The old stories about the Whitmore house had resurfaced, whispered in corners, and passed from one family as the sheriff, a man named James Holloway, had taken the case personally, but even he had found himself at a loss. The case had no clear direction, no obvious suspects, and no answers. As the investigation continued, the town's unease only gave on. House was cursed, that it had been the site of unspeakable crimes long ago. Others believed that the house had simply been abandoned, a relic of a forgotten past that had been left to rot. But now, with a child missing and the town on edge, the old rumors had taken on a new weight. Emily's disappearance had become more than just a mystery. It had become a symbol of the town's buried fears. And as the days passed, the shadows of the past seemed to grow longer, reaching out toward the present like the fingers of a ghost, a new arrival. As the mystery of Emily Carter's disappearance deepened, an unexpected figure arrived in Ashford. Dr. Eleanor Hart, a renowned psychologist and expert in cases involving missing children. She had been invited by the sheriff himself, James Holloway, who had heard of her work in similar cases across the country. Dr. Hart was a woman of quiet determination, her presence commanding respect without the need for words. She had a reputation for seeing the unseen, for uncovering the hidden truth that others overlooked. Her arrival had been met with a mixture of hope and unease. Some in the town saw her as a beacon of hope, a chance to finally uncover the truth behind Emily's disappearance. Others, however, viewed her with suspicion, whispering that she would only bring more darkness into their already troubled lives. But Dr. Hart had not come to Ashford for the town's fears. She had come for the answers. From the moment she stepped into the town, she sensed something was wrong. The air felt heavier, as if the past itself was pressing down on the present. She had read the reports, studied the evidence, and listened to the testimonies of those who had known Emily. But there was something missing, something that could not be explained by the facts alone. The town was holding something back, and she intended to find out what. Her first visit to the Whitmore house had been brief but telling. The place was a relic of a forgotten past, its windows dark and its doors sealed, as if time itself had tried to forget what had happened within. She had walked through the empty halls, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. The silence was not just the absence of sound, it was the presence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something that had been buried for far too long. As she stood before the house, she knew that. She was not just here for Emily Carter, she was here for the truth that had been hidden for years, and she was determined to uncover it no matter the cost. The hidden room. The discovery came unexpectedly, as if the house itself had been waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Dr. Eleanor Hart had returned to the Whitmore house, this time with Marcus Hale and Sheriff Holloway. The air inside was thick with dust and the lingering scent of decay, but it was the silence that unnerved them the most. It was the silence of an abandoned home. It was the silence of an abandoned home. It was the silence of something that had been deliberately hidden, something that had been buried with the intention of being forgotten. They had been searching for any sign of the Whitmore family's last days, but it was not until Marcus Hale noticed a loose floorboard in the parlor that they found anything. He had been running his fingers along the wood, feeling for any irregularities, when the board gave way with a soft creak. The others looked at him in surprise, but he had already knelt down and begun to pry it open. Beneath the floorboard was a small compartment, barely large enough to fit a few objects. Inside, they found a journal, its leather cover worn with age, and a small rusted key. The journal was filled with entries that seemed to belong to a woman, Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch of the family. The handwriting was neat, precise, but the words themselves were laced with fear and desperation. The first entry was dated over 30 years ago, the same year the Whitmore family. Inside they found a journal, its leather cover worn with age, and a small rusted key. The journal was filled with entries that seemed to belong to a woman. Face pale, her eyes wide with fear. No one had followed her, and when the sun rose, she was gone. The town was in chaos. The parallels between the two disappearances were impossible to ignore. Both children had vanished from their homes. Both had been the daughters of women who had left behind cryptic warnings. The sheriff, James Holloway, had been called to the scene immediately, but the evidence was sparse. There were no signs of struggle, no clues to indicate where Sarah had gone. The only thing left behind was a single torn piece of fabric that had been found near the edge of the woods, just like the sock that had been left behind in Emily's case. The fear that had already gripped the town now spread like wildfire. People who had once lived in peace now found themselves looking over their shoulders, whispering in hushed tones about the house that had once been abandoned and the journal that had been found within its walls. Some claimed that the past was returning, that the shadows that had once haunted the Whitmore house were now reaching into the present. Others believed that the disappearances were connected to something far more sinister, something that had been buried for decades and was now beginning to surface. Dr. Eleanor Hart was the first to make the connection. She had studied both cases carefully, comparing the details, the patterns, the strange similarities that seemed to be too coincidental to ignore. She had read the journal, studied the entries, and now, as she looked at the entries, and now that had been buried for decades and was now beginning to surface, Dr. Eleanor Hart was the first to make the connection. Dr. Eleanor Hart was the first to make the connection. She had studied both cases, comparing the details, the part Maj, the right moment to be revealed. The sheriff, too, had begun to suspect that the two cases were linked. He had seen the way the townspeople had reacted, the way the fear had spread like a virus through the community. He had heard the stories, the whispers of the past, the old rumors that had once been dismissed as mere superstition. But now, with two children missing and the journal pointing to something far more sinister, he could no longer ignore the possibility that the past had not been buried after all. As the days passed, the town became more and more unsettled. The disappearances had become a symbol of the town's deepest fears, a reminder that the past was not as distant as they had once believed. And as the shadows grew longer, the truth that had been hidden for so long seemed to be on the verge of being uncovered. The shadow that watches it began with a whisper, not a voice, not a sound, but something that slithered through the air like the breath of a ghost. Marcus Hale had been standing at the edge of the woods, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the darkened trees when he first heard it. It was low, almost imperceptible, but it was there, just beyond the reach of his senses. He turned, his heart pounding, but there was nothing, just the wind, the rustling leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. But the whisper did not fade. It lingered, curling around him like smoke, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. He shook his head, trying to convince himself that it had been nothing more than his imagination. The past had always played tricks on him, had always found a way to haunt him even when he tried to move on. But as he turned back toward the path, he felt it again. This time, not as a whisper, but as a presence. It was not the cold that made his skin crawl, though the air had turned sharply frigid. It was the way the shadows seemed to shift, the way the trees bent as if bowing to something unseen. He took a step forward, and the ground beneath him felt unnaturally soft, as if it had been disturbed by something that had not been there moments before. His flashlight flickered again, and for the briefest moment he saw something in the trees, a shape, barely visible, standing at the edge of the forest. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shape was gone. Marcus's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he tried to steady himself. He had been in countless dangerous situations before, had faced killers, had stared down death itself. But this was different. This was not a man or a woman, not a criminal or a suspect. This was something else, something that had no name, no face, no form. He turned back toward the path, but the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for him. The wind had grown stronger, and now it carried with it a sound that was not of this world, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His flashlight flickered again, and this time he saw it, a shadow, gasped, moving just beyond the reach of the light. It was not a human shadow, not the kind that came from the movement of a body. It was something else, something that had no right to exist. A sudden gust of wind knocked the flashlight from his hands, and in that moment he saw it clearly. The shadow was not just watching him, it was waiting for him to make the first move, to take the first step toward the unknown. And as the wind howled through the trees, he knew that he was no longer alone. The House of Shadows. He knew that he was no longer alone. The House of Shadows. The wind had died down, but the silence that followed was worse. Marcus Hale stood at the edge of the woods, his breath shallow, his body rigid with the weight of what he had just seen. He knew that whatever had been watching him was still out there, still waiting. He had no choice but to move forward. The group, Marcus, Dr. Eleanor Hart, and Sheriff James Holloway had gathered at the Whitmore house once more, their faces pale in the dim light of the setting sun. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the skin on their necks prickle and the breath in their lungs feel heavier. They had come to confront the truth, but as they stepped through the rusted gate and onto the cracked path that led to the house, they all felt the same thing, the weight of the past pressing down on them. The house had not changed, but something about it had. The shadows that had once been mere outlines against the walls now seemed to move, to shift, as if they were alive. The windows, which had once been dark, now seemed to flicker with a faint, unnatural glow. The air was colder now, and the wind that had once whispered through the trees had stopped entirely. It was as if the house had been waiting for them, as if it had been holding its breath for the moment they would finally step inside. Marcus led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they entered the front door. The moment they stepped inside, the silence was deafening. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and the dust that had settled for decades now stirred in the air, swirling around them like ghosts. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Dr. Hart was the first to speak. "This place, it's not just abandoned." The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and the sighting, "It's haunted." Marcus did not answer. He could feel it too, the presence that had been watching them from the moment they arrived. It was not a ghost, not in the way people usually understood the word. It was something else, something that had been buried here for far too long. They moved deeper into the house, past the parlor where the journal had been found, and into the hallway that led to the back of the home. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were trying to pull them deeper into the house. And then they saw it. At the end of the hallway stood a door, one that had not been there before. It was old, its wood warped and cracked, but it was solid. Marcus hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but something inside him refused to let him do so. He reached for the handle, and as he did, the door creaked open, revealing a room that had been hidden for decades. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, but it was not the decay of time. It was the decay of something far more sinister. The walls were lined with old photographs, and in the center of the room stood a chair, a table, and a mirror that reflected something that should not have been there. And then the whisper came again. This time it was not a sound. It was a voice, low and guttural, coming from the mirror. "You should not be here." Marcus turned, his flashlight flickering as he looked around the room. The others were frozen, their eyes wide with fear. And then the shadow appeared. It was not a man, not a woman, not a creature. It was something else, something that had been waiting for this moment, for the right people to come into the house, to uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. And as it stepped forward, the truth of the past finally began to reveal itself, the truth beneath the floor. The shadow moved with an unnatural grace, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. Marcus Hale felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something that had been buried for far too long. The others had frozen, their eyes locked on the figure that had emerged from the darkness, but Marcus knew that if they did not act now, the truth would be lost forever. He stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, and the shadow tilted its head as if studying him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised a hand. The room seemed to freeze, the silence pressing against them like a physical force. And then the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, the glass exploding in 1,000 jagged pieces that scattered across the floor. In the space where the mirror had once stood, something else emerged, a figure, tall and draped in tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood that seemed to absorb the light around it. The presence that had been watching them from the beginning had finally revealed itself. Dr. Eleanor Hart took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "That's not a person," she whispered. "That's something else, something that was never meant to be seen." The figure did not speak, but its presence was suffocating. It was as if the very air had grown heavier, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for the moment they would finally confront the truth. Marcus felt a strange pull, as if the house was trying to tell him something. He stepped forward, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on the journal, still lying on the table where they had left it. He picked it up, his fingers trembling. The pages were still open to the filing its breath for the moment they would finally confront the truth, the one that had warned of the return of something. That had been buried for decades. And then the figure moved. It raised its hand, and the floor beneath them trembled. The ground cracked, and from the cracks a deep, guttural sound echoed through the house. The walls groaned, as if they were being pulled apart from the inside. The air grew colder, and the shadows thickened, stretching toward them like grasping fingers. Marcus knew what this was. He had seen it before, in the dreams that had haunted him for years, in the memories that had refused to fade. This was not just a ghost, not just a memory of the past. It was the truth that had been hidden beneath the floor, beneath the house, beneath the town of Ashford itself. The figure turned toward him, and for the first time, Marcus saw its face. It was not a face at all, but a reflection of the past, of the people who had been lost, of the children who had vanished, of the town that had tried to forget. It was a mirror to the town itself, a reminder that the past had never truly left. And then the truth came rushing in. The house had not been abandoned. It had been a prison, a place where the town had hidden the worst of its sins, the disappearances, the whispers, the fear. It had all been part of a larger, darker history. The whispers, the fear, it had all been part of a larger, darker history. They had been taken not by some unknown force, but by the town itself. The journal had not been a warning. It had been a plea, a desperate attempt to stop the cycle before it was too late. Marcus looked at the others, his heart pounding. He knew what had to be done. The past had to be faced, no matter how painful it was. The truth had to be uncovered, no matter how much it would cost. He turned back to the figure, and for the first time, he spoke. "We can't run from this anymore." The aftermath of the past. The truth had been uncovered, but the weight of it was heavier than any of them had expected. The house had not been abandoned. It had been a prison, a place where the town had buried its own sins, where the past had been locked away in the hopes that it would never return. But now, with the journal in his hands and the figure of the past staring him down, Marcus Hale knew that the town could no longer hide from what it had done. The disappearances of Emily Carter and Sarah Whitmore had not been isolated incidents. They were the echoes of a history that had been ignored for decades, a history that had been buried beneath layers of fear and silence. The Whitmore family had not simply vanished. They had been taken, not by some unknown force, but by the town itself. The journal had been a warning, a desperate attempt to stop the cycle before it was too late. And now, with the truth finally exposed, the town of Ashford had to face the consequences of its own actions. The sheriff, James Holloway, had been the first to speak. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed the Whitmore had not been isolated incidents. The journal had been a warning, a desperate attempt to stop the cycle before it was too late. And now, with the truth finally exposed, the town of Ashford had to face the consequences of its own time that they had just uncovered. "We can't pretend this didn't happen," he said. "We can't ignore it anymore." Marcus looked around at the faces of the townspeople, some filled with fear, others with guilt, and a few with determination. The past had haunted them for years, but now it was no longer something they could ignore. The house had been the symbol of that past, the place where the town had tried to forget. But now it was a reminder of what they had done. Dr. Eleanor Hart had been the one to suggest what had to be done. "We can't just leave it buried," she said. "The truth has to be known. The people who were taken, Emily, Sarah, the others deserve to be remembered. It was a difficult decision." The town had always been tight-knit, its people bound by a shared history that had, until now, been one of silence. But now, that silence had been broken, and with it, the past had been forced into the present, reshaping the lives of everyone who had lived in Ashford. Some of the townspeople had been reluctant, afraid of what the truth might bring. Others had been relieved, as if the burden of the past had finally been lifted from their shoulders. But for Marcus, it was not about relief, it was about justice. The past had haunted them for years, and now it had to be confronted. The house would not be torn down, not yet. It would stand as a reminder, a place where the truth could be told, and where the people of Ash would finally be able to face what they had done. The past had not been forgotten, but it had been acknowledged, and for the first time in decades, the town of Ashford was no longer hiding from its own history. The echoes of the past, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town of Ashford, the weight of the past lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. The house, once a symbol of fear and silence, now stood as a testament to the lives that had been lost and the secrets that had been buried. It was a place where the past had not only haunted the present, but had shaped it in ways that could not be undone. The disappearances of Emily Carter and Sarah Whitmore were not just tragic events, they were the culmination of a history that had been ignored. The house, once a symbol of fear and silence, now stood as a testament to the lives that had been lost and the secrets that had been lost and the secrets that had been buried. It was a place where the past had not only haunted the present, but had shaped it in ways that could not be undone. The disappearances that had been allowed to fester in the shadows. The townspeople, once bound by fear and silence, now found themselves standing at a crossroads. The truth had been unearthed, but with it came the responsibility to confront the ghosts of their own actions. The past had not only shaped the present, but it also left scars that would not easily fade. It was a reminder that the choices made long ago still had repercussions, and that the stories of those who had been lost could not be forgotten. Marcus Hale stood at the threshold of the house, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had transpired. He had come back to Ashford seeking answers, but in doing so, he had unearthed a deeper understanding of the town's complex history. The past was not just a series of events. The crossroads, the chains with the crossroads, which pointed resport Marcus Hale just at the threshold of the house. It was a tapestry woven with the lives of those who had come before, each thread representing a choice, a consequence, and a lesson that could not be ignored. The shadows that had once loomed over the town now seemed to whisper their own stories, echoing the pain and the hope that had been intertwined in the lives of the people who had lived there. The mystery of the past haunting the present was not just a narrative of loss. It was a call to action, a reminder that the past could not be erased, only faced. As the night deepened, the stars began to twinkle above the town, a reminder of the beauty that could emerge from the darkness. The people of Ashford had the opportunity to rewrite their story, to honor the memories of those who had been lost, and to ensure that the past would not be forgotten again. The echoes of the past would continue to haunt the present, but they would also serve as a guiding light, illuminating the path forward for those willing to confront their history and embrace the lessons it had to teach. In the end, it was not the past that had to be forgotten, but the courage to face it that would define the future. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.